It's weird being away. I say this to you every time I come back from a break, but you kind of remember that old Rabbie Burns poem about seeing yourselves as others see you. Would some gift the gift he gives to see ourselves as others see us? And you do a bit when you're away, especially if you come off the news drip, the drip feed of news, and even more importantly, perhaps, social media. The weirdest thing, perhaps, was the absence of, whatever you want to call it, Farage riots, civil disorder, violence on the streets, when compared to the headlines. A couple of threads that I have seen since I got back, actually counting heads at these so-called protests on both sides of the divide. The mixture of massive racists and perfectly ordinary people who like to spend their spare time protesting outside buildings full of refugees, and the anti-racist protesters. Someone actually goes to the trouble of counting them, and the reality of these stories is a tiny fraction of what the media coverage would suggest. I'll share some of the numbers with you shortly, because it matters, doesn't it? And today's news contains two stories that you might consider to be quite important. The first is that the UK has secured an enormous contract to supply Norway with warships. I think the figure I saw was £10 billion. I'm not suggesting for a minute that you've missed that, but you could be forgiven for having done so. It was leading the BBC's coverage yesterday. I don't think it's on a single front page this morning. And then the other story that is, I think, significant is the one about the rollout of 30 hours a week of free childcare to every parent in the country earning less than £100,000 a year. These are massive moments. These are really, really big moments. And yet, I saw one politician being interviewed this morning on television and was actually asked, why are you talking about free childcare when people only care about migrant hotels? And you sort of found yourself thinking, oh, it's the tail that wags the dog, isn't it? Everything now is driven by online metrics. Everything is driven by click counts and what gets the biggest reaction. It's as if the whole world has turned into a radio phone-in show. And how many times have I told you that getting calls is easy, getting attention is easy? Is there anybody old out there feeling poorly? Would you like to ring in and be a little bit racist on the radio? It's really easy to get calls, but it doesn't guarantee that they'll be interesting. So the news is in a bit of a hole. Pretending that problems are much bigger than they are, because the online reaction to these stories and these problems is much bigger than the real life reaction. The numbers, as I say, turning up outside these buildings are relatively tiny. And that, of course, leaves us, you and me, in a tricky position, because should we be talking about this stuff at all? Are we falling into the sort of trap of clickbait, even as we point out that is what is happening here? And the short answer to that is I don't know. But rest assured that we will be talking later in the programme about the rollout of free childcare for untold new numbers of parents. And we will probably have a little look at this big military contract as well. But fears of mass unrest was one of the headlines I saw when I got back. There wasn't any. Warnings of civil disorder was one of the headlines I saw, I think, before I went away. And, of course, there wasn't any. Fears that the hideous scenes of last summer would be repeated, turning that woman Lucy Conley into some sort of folk hero for inciting actual pogroms on British streets. It just hasn't happened in the way that they wanted it to happen. Learned a word just before we went away. I never knew that the word you should use, the correct verb to use when you talk about cogs turning, is mesh. Cogs, they mesh and then they unmesh. So you've got two turning cogs and the teeth aren't biting each other. They're not meshing. And then they mesh and everything starts moving. It's as if these cogs are whirring furiously and they never actually meshed. Thank God. I mean, you know, we saw what can happen when certain political and public figures spread hideous racist lies all over social media, and the next thing you know, they're setting fire to buildings full of entirely blameless and innocent human beings. But they didn't mesh. The cogs didn't mesh. So you find yourself thinking, what's actually happening here? Can we keep this up for 4 years? Are we really going to be doing this until the next general election, pretending that a few weirdos on social media speak for the entire nation? You've got entire political parties in hock now to Billy Buncher numbers with a bulldog avatar. And yet, I can't quite see how it ends. Does it burn itself out? And the only question you're left with is, what will be the next What will be the next chapter? What will be the next incarnation? What will happen next? You have stories, of course, of people being abused as they go about their lawful business because they look a bit foreign. There's one in the news at the moment, which we probably won't touch on further because I think arrests have been made. But the what's the word you want? The empowerment of bigotry is now almost a national pastime. People in the British media who would once have, quite rightly, held their noses at the sight of some of the words coming out of the mouths of politicians are now going all in, joining in on it. And what they do, and this is what I want to talk about today, they deploy the worst sort of inverse snobbery. So what you get with Times columnists or Telegraph columnists, they like to pretend that racism is a working class enthusiasm. They use the words working class, or sometimes even as a synonym for racists. It's as if Cable Street never happened. One of the books I read on holiday was set in the 1930s when Oswald Mosley was on the march. And what everybody forgets, and of course people like the owner of the Daily Mail are desperate for you to forget this because his granddad was one of the best examples of it, is that Mosley's fascism was hugely popular among upper and upper middle classes, right up to and including the aristocracy and even members of the royal family. This idea that racism is a working class enthusiasm is palpably absurd. You bring a bit of a Nyrin Bevan in, who you could see as almost an antidote to Oswald Mosley, then you're left with that classic question of how on earth do you persuade Labour, as in the working man and woman of this country, to use their political freedom to keep wealth in power. And one of the most obvious answers throughout history is to lie to them about the threat that's being posed to them by foreigners. So it's a posh process, institutional racism. It's a posh process designed to dissuade people or distract people from the real reasons for their unhappiness or the inequality that they suffer from by pretending that it would be massively improved if you could ship all those asylum seekers out of the local Holiday Inn. But what happens next? And the short answer to that question when I got back from holiday was very simply flags. Flags to the left of me, flags to the right of me. A particularly interesting new pastime for some members of the British populace is to paint roundabouts. I'll say that again in case you've missed it. So you know the sort of mini roundabouts that are like pimples on the road, like big pimples. So what's the opposite of a crater? Like a sort of, what's the opposite of concave? Convex? Well, like an upturned dish. You know, like a big upturned dish on a road. Not quite big enough to be a roundabout, but too big to be just a sort of crossroad. So so what you do is you find one of those and you paint it white in the middle of the night, and then you paint a big red cross through the middle of it. I saw one which looked a little bit more like the Danish flag than the flag of St. George, but nonetheless that was presumably the intention, unless we've got a sort of Danish nationalist cell operating somewhere in the southeast. But that's another. So that's become a popular pastime while I've been on holiday. That and flags. Flags are going up everywhere. We touched on this just before we went away, and I told you that the story is as old as the hills. I wrote about this in my very first book, 117 years ago, a book called How to Be Right, which sadly is becoming more relevant again as each day passes. And it was about the pretense that being ordered to take down a flag, a particular flag, is somehow an assault upon values. Almost always, councils have rules in, for example, communal areas about what you can and can't put on the walls. And in short, the rule is usually nothing. You can't put anything on the walls. There are also rules governing what you can put up by way of signage if it were, for example, to pose a threat to traffic or to impinge upon visibility. But all of those concerns aside, how emotional does a flag make you feel? I don't think it's right to sneer at people or to snigger. Because, for example, the Ukrainian flag carries enormous heft at the moment, as does, of course, the Palestinian flag, as the unconscionable murder of countless civilians and killing of journalists in Gaza continues. The Palestinian flag carries enormous power. For many people, the Israeli flag carries enormous power. So to say that flags, to imbue flags with power is somehow wrong, is clearly arrogant. You might think it's silly, but I bet there's a flag that you would have an emotional reaction to. So here's a question no one's asked you yet. And it may be because you think the answers are obvious or the answers are straightforward. Why are they doing it? 0345 6060 973. To personalise it for a moment, why have I returned from holiday to find... I mean, listen, my evidence is mostly photographic, I have to tell you. I haven't encountered that many actual flags, but I've got mates who have. They've sent me pictures, and there's one outside Greg's on Chiswick High Road, which is the sort of next town along from where I live in West London. And I just want to know why. I want to know why you think people are doing this. And I want you to be as honest as you can. I'll give you one warning. One of my holiday covers last week, Emily Thornberry, got into terrible trouble for posting online without any comment at all a picture of someone's front yard, which, if memory serves, contained a transit van, a white transit van, and a flag of St. George dangling from a window. That's all she did. But it was argued, I think fairly, that she was casting some sort of judgment on these people. And you're not allowed to do that in Brexit Britain. You're not allowed to say, do you know what, I'd rather my neighbours didn't hang a sort of massive piece of tatty nylon out of their spare bedroom window and leave it there as it got battered and sullied by the elements. You're not allowed to do that because people will pretend that you're being unpatriotic or that you're assaulting their values. And that is important to remember because I don't want you to get into any trouble. But I do want you to think about this question. Why are they doing it? Or, of course, why are you doing it? Can we find the positives? 0345 6060 973. I've got one story. It happened on my street a few years ago, my old house. And I think it was football related. But one of my neighbours put a flag of St. George. And another neighbour actually had a Chelsea flag, which followed a similar fate, actually. But we'll focus on the flag of St. George. And they put it over their balcony. It was a block of flats next to the house where I lived. And I didn't really give it a second thought, particularly because I think it was in the middle of the Euros or possibly even a World Cup. I forget, you forgive me. And they never took it down. And you stop noticing it. You do that, right? So you stop noticing things. If you're a man... you never notice things that have been left at the bottom of the stairs, for example, for you to take upstairs. But if you are human and something has been part of your backdrop, the backdrop of your daily life indefinitely, you stop noticing it. And I did stop noticing it until an estate agent came around and sort of winced when they saw it. And by that point, it had been there for about 18 months since the end of the football tournament. I presume the people living in the flat had actually forgotten about it, because it had become invisible to them as well. And by now, it was it wasn't even grey, it was sort of brown. It was a brown flag with a red cross through the middle of it. One bit had sort of come loose on the end, so it wasn't hanging true. It was dangling off a balcony on a block of flats, and I mean, it might still be there now, actually. I can't even remember. And that's the problem with this stuff. It's not really adorning or improving your natural environment. It's not an act of community. So what is it an act of? Why is it being done? What is the point being made?